Did the recent death of President Ebrahim Raisi mark the end of an era or the beginning of new controversies? From his early days as a young prosecutor to his rise to the highest office in the land, Raisi's story is one of ambition, conviction, and controversy. Ebrahim Raisi's most notorious controversy is rooted in the darkest chapter of Iran's modern history, the 1988 mass executions of political prisoners. As a young deputy prosecutor in Tehran, Raisi was a key member of the infamous Death Committee, a group tasked with overseeing the execution of thousands of prisoners, many of whom were affiliated with the Mujahedin-e-Khalq MEK opposition group. The executions, which took place over the course of several months, were characterized by their speed, secrecy, and lack of due process. Prisoners were brought before the committee in brief arbitrary trials, often lasting just a few minutes. Those deemed enemies of the state were sentenced to death, their fates sealed by the stroke of a pen. Raisi's role in these extrajudicial killings has been widely condemned by human rights organizations, with Amnesty International leading calls for investigations into his involvement. The 1988 executions remain a deeply traumatic memory for many Iranian families who lost loved ones during this dark period. Despite this, Raisi remained unapologetic about his involvement, even as he rose through the ranks of Iran's judiciary and political system. Throughout his career in Iran's judiciary, he was implicated in numerous human rights abuses and criticized for his hardline approach to justice. As a judge, and later as the head of the judiciary, Raisi was known for his harsh sentencing and crackdown on political dissidents, journalists, and activists. His tenure was marked by a lack of due process, the use of torture to extract confessions, and the suppression of free speech and political opposition. One notable example of Raisi's hardline approach came in 2009, during the protests that followed the disputed re-election of then-President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. As a senior judicial official, Raisi played a key role in the crackdown on demonstrators, which saw thousands arrested and subjected to brutal interrogations and torture. Despite his controversial past, Raisi's tenure as president was marked by attempts to address some of Iran's most pressing economic challenges. Faced with crippling international sanctions, high inflation, and widespread unemployment, Raisi sought to chart a new course for the country's economy. At the heart of his economic vision was a focus on boosting domestic production and reducing Iran's dependence on foreign imports. Raisi's administration promoted policies designed to support local industries and agriculture, with the aim of creating jobs and stimulating economic growth. His efforts to boost domestic production and diversify trade relationships were seen by some as a necessary response to the country's economic isolation. In the early days of the pandemic, Iran struggled to contain the outbreak, with hospitals overwhelmed and medical supplies running short. Raisi's administration came under fire for its initial handling of the crisis, with critics accusing the government of downplaying the severity of the situation and failing to take swift action. One of the key challenges facing Iran during the pandemic was the shortage of vaccines. With international sanctions limiting the country's access to foreign-made vaccines, Raisi's government worked to secure deals with countries like Russia and China, while also investing in domestic vaccine production. Despite these efforts, Iran's vaccination campaign got off to a slow start, with public distrust and logistical challenges hampering progress. However, over time, the Raisi administration was able to accelerate the rollout, with millions of Iranians receiving their shots by the end of his tenure. Another area where Raisi sought to make his mark as president was in the realm of infrastructure development. Throughout his tenure, he prioritized a range of major projects, from dams and highways to housing developments and industrial parks. One of the most high-profile projects of the Raisi era was the inauguration of the dam on the Aras River, a joint venture between Iran and neighboring Azerbaijan. The dam, which was completed in 2021, was hailed as a symbol of regional cooperation and a key step in managing the two countries' shared water resources. Other notable infrastructure initiatives under Raisi included the expansion of Iran's rail network, with new lines connecting major cities and boosting regional trade. The government also invested heavily in the construction of affordable housing, with the aim of addressing Iran's chronic housing shortage and creating jobs in the construction sector. Critics argued that some of these projects were more about boosting Raisi's political image than addressing the country's most pressing needs. Raisi's path to the presidency in 2021 was not without its controversies. The election, which saw him win a landslide victory, was marred by allegations of electoral manipulation and a historically low voter turnout. In the run-up to the election, Iran's Guardian Council disqualified a large number of potential candidates, including several high-profile reformists and moderates. Critics argued that this was a deliberate attempt to clear the way for Raisi's victory, effectively turning the election into a one-horse race. The disqualifications, combined with growing disillusionment among Iranian voters, led to a record-low turnout of just 48.8%. Many Iranians chose to boycott the election altogether, seeing it as a sham process designed to rubber-stamp Raisi's ascent to power. Another major scandal that dogged Raisi's presidency was his government's heavy-handed response to protests and dissent. Raisi's government often responded to these protests with force, deploying security forces to disperse crowds and arrest demonstrators. In November 2019, when nationwide protests erupted over a sudden hike in fuel prices, the demonstrations quickly turned into a broader outcry against the government's handling of the economy and political repression. Raisi, who was then the head of the judiciary, played a key role in the government's response, which saw security forces kill hundreds of protesters and arrest thousands more. The brutality of the crackdown shocked the international community and further damaged Iran's already strained relations with the West. As president, Raisi continued to take a hardline approach to dissent, with his government regularly cracking down on activists, journalists, and opposition figures. This stance drew widespread condemnation from human rights groups and foreign governments. Despite his efforts to boost the economy and improve living standards, Raisi's tenure was heavily impacted by the crippling sanctions regime imposed on Iran by the United States and its allies. The sanctions, which targeted key sectors of Iran's economy, including oil exports and banking, had a devastating impact on the country's finances and its ability to engage in international trade. Raisi's government sought to mitigate the impact of the sanctions by boosting domestic production and forging closer ties with countries like China and Russia. But these efforts had limited success. One of the key sticking points in Iran's relations with the West was the issue of the 2015 nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. The deal, which had been negotiated under Raisi's predecessor, Hassan Rouhani, had provided Iran with sanctions relief in exchange for limits on its nuclear program. However, in 2018, then U.S. President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew from the deal and reimposed harsh sanctions on Iran. Raisi, who took office 3 years later, initially signaled a willingness to revive the deal, but talks ultimately stalled over disagreements about the scope of sanctions relief and Iran's nuclear activities. The failure to secure a new deal and the continuation of the sanctions regime had a profound impact on Iran's economy and society. Inflation soared, the currency plummeted in value, and unemployment remained stubbornly high. As we've explored, Ebrahim Raisi's life and career were marked by significant achievements and deep controversies. His rise through the ranks of Iran's judiciary to become the nation's president was shaped by his staunch conservatism and commitment to the Islamic Republic's principles. Raisi's tenure was controversial due to his involvement in the 1988 mass executions, a period that has cast a long shadow over his career. His presidency continued to be contentious, with allegations of human rights abuses and a hardline stance that often put him at odds with both domestic and international observers. Despite these controversies, Raisi also sought to address some of Iran's pressing issues. His economic policies aimed to reduce inflation, tackle unemployment, and boost domestic production amidst severe international sanctions. His efforts to manage the COVID-19 pandemic and initiate infrastructure projects highlighted his attempts to improve the country's situation. Ultimately, Ebrahim Raisi's legacy is a complex tapestry of judicial rigor, economic reform efforts, and human rights controversies. His death in the tragic helicopter crash marked the end of a contentious yet impactful political career. As history continues to unfold, the full impact of Raisi's presidency will be evaluated by future generations. His life serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities and challenges faced by those who navigate the turbulent waters of political leadership in modern Iran. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue exploring the figures who shape our world's history.